Welcome to The Mohit Show. In this video, I'll be covering posts from r/detrans, a well-moderated subreddit for people questioning, desisting, or detransitioning. On to this video's first post, titled, The Ideological Roots of Gender Dysphoria, an essay. This will actually also be this video's only post. This is by a detrans male. What is gender dysphoria? Gender dysphoria is a severe mental disorder that is diagnosed as systematically reported discomfort with the sex of the patient. That is, a man who suffers from GD is a man who suffers from a severe illness in which he feels that his body is the wrong sex, which leads to feelings of discomfort and disgust regarding all that he perceives to be the sexed features of his body. These feelings should be strong and recurrent for a long period of time. For example, a friend of mine said that his life would be easier if he was a hot woman, which means he wouldn't have to work hard. But that is not gender dysphoria, since it is only one way to manifest the opinion that hot women have an easier life than other people. For gender dysphoria to be diagnosed, it needs to be recurrent and strong enough to impair functioning. We will see that this mental disorder is a very recent social construct that is derived from the tacit acceptance of specific spiritual framework. Let me elaborate. Gender dysphoria and gender ideology. Wookie Haircuts said in a comment to another post, many people on this subreddit are taking feminizing hormones and do not believe they can ever be women. However, I did find a correlation with gender dysphoria in AGPs, autogynephiliacs, and belief that you have a female soul, but the direction of causation isn't known. So it might help some AGPs to understand that they are not or cannot be literal women, but many will still be unhappy with their bodies and will continue to feel unhappy unless they take feminizing hormones or find some other method to get rid of dysphoria. Funny fact, roughly 40 years ago, nobody reported feelings such as feeling unhappy with their bodies in the sense of having a body of the wrong gender. Now, hundreds of thousands of people report these feelings. Why? Back in the 1980s, when Blanchard and co-authors were creating the concept of AGP, they saw patients which were typically middle-aged men with a cross-dressing fetish that were obsessed with the idea of changing their sex. People 40 to 50 years ago believed there was a thing called a sex change operation, and they believed that sex change was a real deal, unlike cross-dressing, which was regarded as only pretending to be the opposite sex. Back then, their symptoms were not about hating their bodies, but about wanting to become women. The idea they associated with sexual gratification. So how can gender dysphoria come about? Its origins lay with the mainstream conception of transsexualism instead of Blanchard's approach focused on paraphilias. Harry Benjamin reported a rather sophisticated case a couple of decades earlier, the case of a man called William J. O'Connell. The leopard cannot change its spots, and I cannot alter, if I would, the basic femininity of my psyche. If there is indeed an eternal soul, then I suppose mine to be in gender feminine. At all events, what is certain is that from babyhood I have known, call it intuition, call it recognition, known beyond all doubt that I belonged among women, and so longed to take my place there. Englishmen born and raised in India go home to England. So, with me, always. To be a woman would be to come home, a dull home perhaps, that of a 34-year-old spinster, but still and always home. This would be my happiness, to wake tomorrow and find myself just such as a woman. It is, you may think, especially if you are yourself such a woman, a curious sort of happiness to pursue. True, but plain water is more than champagne to one in desert lands. The pain in my life is not merely that caused by prejudice and misunderstanding. Far more, it is the pain of conflict, the profound dichotomy of mind and body. I have, perforce, lived a lie as a man and a boy, always painful, always false. Yet to dress as a woman, not being one, is equally false as well as dangerous. What then to do? A problem implies a solution. The solution to mind is to alter one of the elements, mind or the body, to conform to the other. Putting aside the possibility of an unchangeable feminine soul, I still must say that my mind and heart, my 35 psyche, have been shaped by a million longings and choices and feminine values. I could not acquire a masculine psyche without ceasing to be myself. Any psychiatrist would admit that the cure is hopeless. But if a mind conforming is not a solution, there remains the alternative, changing the body to fit the mind. This, within limits, is possible. And to people that accept false teeth and spectacles, plastic surgery and artificial limbs, it ought to not appear unreasonable. A man may be made endocrinally female by the female hormones, which control the secondary sexual characteristics of hair and breasts, and anatomically female by the removal of male organs and the surgical creation of a vagina. She cannot bear children, but surely if she is female in anatomy and hormones and psyche, she is a woman. This limited womanhood became my goal. This was the happiness I pursued. My decision was made in the clear perception that my life was quite a bit intolerable in its falseness. After some hard, realistic thinking, I went to a sexologist, a man wise in the ways of glands and their secretions. He received me with kindness and understanding and sent me to a psychiatrist who confirmed his judgment that I was of sound mind and quite competent to decide where my happiness lay. Then he carefully began the process of feminization by the administration of estrogen and other female hormones. Months went by while my breasts began to develop, and other changes took place, and while my doctor studied me and tested and observed. Then at last, a glorious day, he approved me for surgery. And this is from the Transsexual Phenomenon, pages 34 through 35. This narrative was written around 1960 and published in the highly influential book, The Transsexual Problem. This kind of narrative became the blueprint for gender identity ideology. That people have a sexed soul separate from the body, and that the body can be changed to match the sex of the soul. Also, note that this guy really believes that a sex change operation changes the person's sex, like Blanchard's patients. But, like Blanchard's patients, the patient Harry Benjamin quotes never reported the symptoms we associate with gender dysphoria today, that is, the feeling of discomfort with his body. His symptoms were instead platonic symptoms. He believed that he had a soul that was matched to the wrong body and that to achieve happiness, his soul should be placed in the correct body, that his soul could migrate from body to body in the same way that an Englishman born in India could return to England. Today, people who identify as gender dysphoric report different symptoms from this platonic conception. Instead, they claim to feel uncomfortable or to hate their body, because that is the symptom they were socially conditioned to develop and perhaps associate with gender. Humans do not develop gender dysphoria if they are not socially induced to develop it. That is because humans are bodies. A man is a man, and a woman is a woman. Saying that you're a man trapped in a woman's body is just nonsense from an objective perspective. It can only make sense if you assume that humans are not animals living in the real world, but magical spirits that inhabit a body. That is, suppose that people are souls that wear their bodies as if they were meat suits. Then, if you think your body is a meat suit you wear, then you think your body might be uncomfortable. And this belief, combined with the idea that maybe if you had a female meat suit, you would feel better, leads to the belief that if changing your sex will make you feel better, this belief is what leads you to the feeling that your sex characteristics are disgusting. Hey, I'd like to just interject right here that this idea really isn't exclusive to souls and having that separate from the body. It's the idea that a separate thing from the body is specifically sexed. For example, if you look in Christian religion, you'll find that they often describe, things like angels or the metaphysical sense of things to be less sexed. So that idea of your soul having a sex is also something new that came about during this era. Returning. Therefore, to first believe your soul can be mismatched in some way, which leads either to belief discomfort or this platonic desire to be a woman, it is only if you have the delusional belief of being something else than your body. Then you can develop the belief that you are in the wrong body. For example, among hundreds of people who identify as gender dysphoric, I never heard one say, I am disgusting. They say, I hate my body. They can only say that because they actually fail to understand that they are their bodies. That case Benjamin reported had some of these characteristics. It is a bit different, but the main ideological elements that allow people today to develop gender dysphoria are there. People have sexed souls that can be mismatched to the body, and this mismatch can be corrected with the magic of sex change. However, other elements were more platonic. Instead of formulating the concept of treatment of gender dysphoria as distress from being born in the wrong body, he thought that the path to happiness lay in changing his sex because his soul was female. Also, today people who report gender dysphoria tend to believe that hormones are the really important component of the magical cure rather than sex change surgery. Most transgender people do not even have it today, from this person's view. These are cultural differences because we live in a different time. If the label gender dysphoria will still be in clinical use in 50 years, then the reported symptoms of gender dysphoria in the future will be very different from the symptoms that are reported today. The fact is that gender dysphoria lacks a very precise psychiatric definition, and the poorly defined nature of it motivated me to write a satirical piece that pokes a big hole in the DSM-5 diagnosis of gender dysphoria, since their definition can be shown to logically imply that men who regularly shave their beards have gender dysphoria. Do you shave regularly? That might be a symptom of gender dysphoria on Substack. This only shows that the concept of gender dysphoria is poorly formulated by the psychiatric profession at the moment. Now, modern Gnosticism. Gender ideology is in fact a modern version of the Gnostic cults that emerged in the days of the Roman Empire. People thought that salvation meant recognizing that material reality is evil, in the case of gender dysphoria, to believe that your real body is evil, and trying to transcend by learning the secrets of God, which they call gnosis. In the case of gender dysphoria, transitioning to the right sex. These similarities have been perceived by some conservative political commentators. That is why I think it is correct to state that gender ideology is a religious cult. Gender dysphoria can only exist if one accepts these fundamentally religious concepts. Also, we should keep in mind that religious feelings have been shown to be as strong as any others, and that also means people can be willing to do anything for religious beliefs, including suicide. And also, religious beliefs can cause extreme, severe mental disorders. Just because a concept has religious origin instead of a physical origin does not mean it is less genuine. Puberty and gender dysphoria. Many teenagers report feeling weird about their puberty. That is because they grow fast, and these changes can sometimes be perceived as bad. Then these teenagers might come into contact with gender ideology, which states that these feelings are caused by the body-soul mismatch. Teenagers are gullible, and it is easy to make them interpret natural feelings from growing up as some sort of body-soul mismatch. It is by interpreting their feelings through the ideological framework that claims that bodies are meat suits, which can lead to the development of gender dysphoria. This is why gender dysphoria is so endemic in this demographic, and why it can be common among teenager people without unusual sexual proclivities such as homosexuality or AGP. Homosexuality, AGP, and gender dysphoria. Homosexuality can lead to the conclusion that the person has a female soul. What differentiates men and women more than anything else in mainstream society is that men marry women and women marry men. Homosexuals do not want to do that because they are sexually attracted to the same sex. In fact, among poorly educated people in developing countries, it is often understood that homosexuals are not real members of their sex, and they partly define the sex of a person as the social role of procreation. In addition, homosexuals have brains closer to the opposite of sex, and also gay men tend to look slightly more feminine on average than straight men, and butch lesbians tend to look slightly more masculine on average than straight women. So if they come in contact with gender ideology, they can rather easily develop the belief that they have a male/female soul trapped in a female/male body. AGP, autogenophilia, requires a bit more mental work to lead to gender dysphoria. Typically, it is a middle-aged man who has cross-dressed for decades that slowly developed a female character that he portrays in his cross-dressing sessions. After many years of doing it and then coming into contact with gender ideology, he starts to believe that maybe he is not a real man, but a female spirit inhabiting a male body. Back in Blanchard's days, these men never developed the symptoms of gender dysphoria while having lived as men for decades, and in most cases marrying and having kids, because gender ideology did not exist in its present form, and there was no internet to spread this ideology around. Summary. An important evolution in gender ideology over the past few decades is that back in the 1980s, people believed there was a sex change surgery, while people today believe that gender is separate from sex, and also believe gender is inborn, and finally believe that gender confirmation surgery instead of sex change surgery is a necessary measure to achieve happiness. This means that today we think people are born transgender, which implies that many people are brainwashed to believe that if they do not undergo the magical ritual of gender confirmation, they will be forever impaired since they are repressed transgender, which naturally leads to gender dysphoria. In the past, men and women just thought they were men or women, and that they could become women or men by having a sex change. Hence, why it was called sex change surgery and not gender confirmation surgery. Then some people thought it was okay to be their sex, but it would be even better to be the other sex and identified as transsexual. These people didn't feel disgusted with their sex, they just felt it would be better to switch to the other sex, which means they did not develop any beliefs of disgust towards their bodies. Now things changed. Teenagers are brainwashed into believing that they need to transition to the opposite sex, and that they need to do it quickly before they become unable to pass, otherwise they will be unhappy. This is what causes the modern form of gender dysphoria. From the comments, someone desisted says, it's clear there are huge subcultures online ready to prey upon anyone with gender issues, saying things like you quoted in your essay, like shaving regularly is a sign of gender dysphoria. Everything is a sign of gender dysphoria. We retroactively assign behaviors and attitudes to our childhood to say we were too gender non-conforming and had too much dislike for the way our sex was treated to be who we are. It makes me more upset every day just how much of this preys upon people who need to heal and who need actual help with distorted thinking and gender roles, society, and just life in general. Questioning your own gender transition. The person was questioning their own gender transition is making this comment. I also sense a strong tie to the technological utopia where our discomforts are relieved by altering our physical or mind state while keeping us in constant commerce for something impossible. When did we cease to be content with a body-lived experience? A 70s intersex to male. And as a side note, intersex medically refers to those born with genital deformities, those who have had their genitals destroyed, and those with chromosome disorders. Now a comment from a detrans male. It is an interesting observation. The main issue I see is that the entire premise hinges on the idea that feeling pain and distress in your body is only a recently observed phenomenon. I don't think it is. I think it's just a language of describing this pain as evolved, especially due to the high scrutiny trans people come under, put themselves under in order to be considered real trans. The language patterns of how to correctly define your feelings get studied and learned and refined and copied over generations, exponentially true since the birth of the internet. I just think the patient did indeed describe a deep unsettling discomfort with the male body. They just did it with the language that was available to them as one of the first people to voice these feelings without being challenged on it. To me, it sounds like somebody attempted to convey a deeply painful discomfort with the male body. Remember that a lot of what trans people say publicly is carefully engineered to sound as convincing and genuine as possible. This isn't a dig as trans people. We did it all because we wanted access to medication we felt we needed in words to convince our doctors. In 1960, this approach of chronic discomfort may not have been enough to convince a psychologist new to the idea of transsexualism. It actually sounds kind of trivial when you think about it. Do you want me to perform experimental medicine on you just because you feel uncomfortable? So instead, the patient chooses to focus on a different line of reasoning. They chose a more metaphysical approach. I still believe the pain and discomfort was there. I still felt the pain and discomfort during the mid-90s, and I would easily say the trans people I knew at the time felt it as keenly. I still have my old diary from the time, and the language I used is not the same as you would see in 2020, but the feelings that prompted the language were certainly the same. Perhaps I'm nitpicking though, because I don't entirely disagree with the overall premise that gender dysphoria is a socialized condition in the vast majority of cases. I see plenty of examples where this has definitely been the case, such as on this board, and not many that are convincingly otherwise beyond faith. As a little aside, I am disgusting was the strength of what I felt and the kind of language I would use, as well as the kind of language I felt common in the time of my transition. I couldn't speak for now because I don't move in modern trans circles and haven't in many years, but I'm actually surprised and possibly a little doubtful that trans people don't claim to feel this anymore. And the original poster says, pain is a term that I think should be used for the sensation when you cut your arm. I don't think this term should be used for psychological conditions. The sensation of pain from having your arm cut off is not remotely similar to gender dysphoria. People have always felt psychological distress. Now, in modern society, we have created a culture of feeding this distress and associating this distress with parts of ourselves. For example, people with anorexia are people that channel their distress to their perceived inadequacy in terms of body mass. It is a culturally constructed mental illness. 1,000 years ago, anorexia simply didn't exist. Gender dysphoria is like anorexia, but related to a perceived inadequacy in terms of sex characteristics rather than body mass. And this anorexia regarding sex characteristics is a recent phenomenon. This essay about anxiety is very good because the author, a political scientist, understands the socially constructed aspects of mental disorders. Now, I personally have to comment on this previous comment right here. That this person is talking about the feelings of that man whose quote was read in the main essay. And this individual says that these feelings are so close to what they feel now and such. Oh yeah, this definitely existed. But they fail to acknowledge that this person only came and wrote this after they found out about sex change surgery. After they were presented with the idea that your sex could change and that the thing inside of your head, which in this time would be called the soul, is different than what you are physically are. And thus that's something that should be changed. And you can see here that this person lived his way and he simply says all his decisions were feminine. As such, this was just a feminine guy. But after being given the idea that you could actually change your sex, he went forward and thought that his soul must have been mismatched because he didn't fit the strict gender roles of 1960s. So another person who is desisted comments, this is a very narrow view of gender identity. There's a recent boom in the culture around gender, but neither gender nor identity are new or rationally debatable concepts. Identity formation is a core part of psychology that we've been studying for hundreds of years, and gender is just a social and psychological counterpart of sex, which has existed for as long as humans have walked the earth. I get that you're talking about a specific dynamic, and that within you're defining gender as some sort of metaphysical that requires a spiritual framework of sorts. Maybe be clear about that. Maybe acknowledge that this is just one particular dynamic. There are plenty of known dynamics, mine included, that don't fit the narrative here. If you just focus on this one dynamic instead of generalizing it as a blanket discovery about gender identity, maybe it would be fine. Another issue I have with this is you write so much about AGP without actually ever touching on what's going on in someone with this dynamic. Unless I missed it, not a single mention of becoming the object of your own desire. Do you consider yourself AGP, OP? If so, do you believe you understand what's actually going on inside of you? You mentioned a middle-aged man who's cross-dressed for decades and finally takes the leap. Why do you think he cross-dressed in the first place? If you understand this, isn't that a pretty foundational thing to draw into an essay on the growth in prevalence of AGP? So first of all, this is a very dishonest commentary right here. So, first of all, the attack on the end is simply a derailment of the discussion to try to attack the person's character and the issues that the person are feeling. That's not cool to do. But the other thing is that they simply say that they have a different dynamic without saying what else is different about the dynamic and without even understanding the actual definitions of the essay. That gender itself is a crystallization of identity into a category that can be wrong. And that's the actual issue. Yet this guy pretends that gender as a category existed as long as identity has existed, which is clearly not true. Now, the original poster says, psychologists have not conceptualized gender as a concept separate from sex until very recently, roughly around the 1960s. And in fact, it doesn't appear to have any scientific justification. A person is a man or a woman, because that person is a human male or a human female. It was only after doctors invented the concept that men might become women or women might become men, they should have sex change, then they had to invent a psychological concept of sex separate from the biological concept of sex, which cannot be changed. In regards to cross-dressing fetishism, this is a very common male fetish. It exists in around 3 to 5% of heterosexual males, so it's a pretty common fetish. It occurs because some men have a sensibility to sexual stimuli that are internal rather than external. Why this sensibility exists? That's a matter of neuroscientific research. So far, the evidence appears to suggest that it might have a relation with mirror neurons. Do you think that 5% of men are women born into a male body, and that the cross-dressing fetish is a manifestation of their inner female spirit, and that's trying to get out? Well, that's a religious belief. It's not a scientific belief, since it's not a testable hypothesis that can be falsified by empirical evidence. A lot of different fetishes are classified as AGP, and a few of these fetishes might occur in some cases but not in others. For example, there are men that are exclusively aroused by the idea of being penetrated during sex, but have no attraction to female clothes. Other men are exclusively aroused by the fantasy of having a vagina, without any other peripheral fetish. Other men only have cross-dressing fetishism without any of the behavioral and interpersonal AGP fetishes. I don't think lumping all these fetishes as AGP is in fact useful. And the desisted person replies, you seem to disagree that gender identity exists, but I'm not really clear on what basis. Do you believe that your relationship with sex isn't or couldn't be part of your identity? Ethnicity, relationships, career, hobbies, disability, sexuality, and so many of things are well-known aspects of identity. Why would sex be one random exception? I would go a step further to argue that the core of sexual identification happens so young that it's a foundational aspect of identity. So first, I have to say right here, ethnicity is something you can't change. Sexuality is something you have and is a physical thing that has physical implications on what you like. Disabilities are also a physical thing. Your hobbies are things you choose and can change at any time. Your career is also the same, and so are your relationships. However, this person is going to categorize gender, which is an abstract collection of different things that are only created by society, as opposed to hobbies, which aren't social constructs, or sexuality, which is not a social construct. There's a significant difference here. Okay, but of course, we continue building on our sexual identity throughout our life, and plenty of people have major developments in and around puberty, but this is one of those aspects of identity that cuts deep. I feel this is important to acknowledge because it dispels any misunderstanding over gender being a transient mood or feeling, or something we just pick up and set back down. What you choose to do about cross-sex gender identity varies widely, and whether anybody ever really has a transition is certainly debatable, but the identification with the other sex is a pretty straightforward dynamic. No, not at all. It's just biology, psychology, and so on. It's my understanding that the core dynamic of AGP is in becoming the object of your own desire. It's about transposing your own identity into the target of your attraction so that you can become the recipient of your own desire. Attraction, affection, lust, or whatever unexpressible and unfulfilled psychology need to have going on. Now that you've shared your perspective on it, I see that you have a different view somewhat in line with sexual empathy. That's fine with me. My main contention is that you wrote a big long essay dismissing the experience of people suffering from AGP without really touching on why they might be experiencing it or what they can do about it. I don't think lumping all these fetishes as AGP is useful, in fact. Agree the term is most closely related to an actual desire to transition, so it makes the most sense to keep it as someone who truly wants to become female. Any of these other dynamics you mentioned just seem to be obscured as something transgender related. I also have to say right here, if you have AGP as a fetish, you can have it, and you don't need to do anything about it. It's okay to have fetishes. Now my comments. What the individual writing the main essay addresses is that having a specific identity category for gender is a new idea. The concept of gender was invented around the 1960s. Otherwise, what we would not now call gender would be personality traits surrounding a person. They were irrespective of sex. You could have a masculine woman and a masculine man. You could have a feminine man and a feminine woman. Of course, these people were stigmatized, but it was never a common societal belief that this meant there was a fundamental mismatch internally with the individual, or that the individual needs to be changed physically to become different. Gender dysphoria only came about when society grouped their personalities with a label and conflated that label with sex. It was only at that point that you could have a gender, and that gender could be wrong or not matched with your body. But there were other instances where similar changes were desired, but those came from a fundamentally different root. Sometimes it was divine possession, sometimes it was a fetish, sometimes it was to make people sing higher, sometimes it was to create a class of people who had no familial interests. Sometimes it was just a result of societal oppression of feminine men to keep them in a separate category as if something was wrong. Something to note is that most commonly throughout history, these are men seeking feminine traits or castration. The key here is that the modern phenomenon of people feeling that their body/soul is in the wrong body and feeling dysphoria/psychological stress at their natural body is a relatively new phenomenon, coinciding with the definition of gender and the development of modern gender theory or critical gender theory. In fact, it is, in fact, possible to allow people to be who they are and not confine them to predefined social construct. Modern gender theory does not allow that. And that'll be the end of this video.